State Formations, Histories and Cultures of Statehood. I am proud to be the director of the center. And I'm just here briefly to make the obvious point. We're here to hear Professor Skinner's presentation on the person of the state. Greg Anderson will be making the more fulsome introduction. Meanwhile, we have what might be termed a message from our sponsor, Executive Dean of Arts and Sciences, David Manishai.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here as your sponsor. The College of Arts and Sciences is very pleased to support the Center for Historical Research, and we've done that for the last 8 years, since its inception, 2007. And over that time, the center has brought over 100 visitors and fellows to campus, and those visitors and fellows have come from 50 different institutions. And that shows the breadth. And I think what's very telling is that this center has become a model for other institutions that have developed similar centers for historical research. And what I find particularly compelling about the center is its multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary nature. It not only cuts across fields within the field of history, but it cuts to other departments, English, other comparative studies, other departments in the humanities and the arts, but also other departments in the social sciences. And I think that's where scholarship is going these days, and thus I'm very happy to be able to continue the college support of the center. That is our message from your sponsor. Thank you very much. I do apologize. I do have to go at this time of year. There are many demands of my time, but when I got this invitation, I said, absolutely. Thank you.
I'm not going to bother with this. It's too awkward. Anyway, I was the original author of this program, although I had a lot of help from other people subsequently. I just wanted to say a few words of closure before we bid goodbye to our beloved program. Now, the original intent of it was, if I can paraphrase Raymond Carver or his editor, what do we historians talk about when we talk about states? Because it seems to me, and always has seemed to me, that we talk about a lot of different states. We talk about the sovereign state, the temple state, the theatre state, the sexual state, the gendered state, the early state, the medieval state, the ancient state, and so forth. And we talk about the states of Marx, the state of Weber, the state of Charles Tilly, of Michael Mann, of Timothy Mitchell, of Wendy Brown, and so forth. This multitude of different states that we're all talking about as if they're all mutually intelligible and mutually comprehensible. What we wanted to do was to get, as it were, representatives of all those different states present under our umbrella for 2 years to give us their sense of what this state entity is all about, or these multiple entities as we would prefer. So we tried to get as many people as we could from as many different backgrounds as we could, from anthropology, poli-sci, philosophy, history, sociology, as well as people covering all types of different times and places in history. And I'll leave it to others to decide whether the program has been very successful. I hope that it has. For now, I just want to say a huge thank you to all who've made it possible. First of all, and above all, to our invitees, and our fellows. We've had 5 different fellows over the 2 years, and our many commenters, many of whom have come from different departments. Obviously, they've supplied most of the content for this program, so we have to be grateful to them. Of course, to our Dean, to the Colleges of Arts and Sciences, to the Dean of Humanities, the various members of the OSU administration who have been, I would have to say, ceaselessly supportive of this whole enterprise. We are deeply grateful. And of course, to our anonymous donor, whoever he may be, if it is a he, we are very grateful as well. Peter Hahn, the chair of the history department, has been tireless in his efforts to support this venture, and also the many staff across the campus, particularly in our department and in the Blackwell Hotel, who helped to facilitate all of this happening. To the graduate students who've taken 7725, the associated colloquium class, over these last 2 years, about 20 students altogether, just over, for their many different contributions. And of course to the colleagues in history who have helped to put this whole thing together. Particularly I have to single out Tina Sessa, and Ying Zhang, who were both very heavily involved in the early days of putting this program together. So thank you to them. But finally, above all perhaps, to my irrepressible colleague John Brooke, with his tireless, restless curiosity, his incredible, almost obscene levels of energy. Without him, this program just wouldn't have been possible. Okay, with that, yes. So with that, it's my great pleasure and privilege to welcome Quentin Skinner to our campus to conclude our series. He is the Barbara Beaumont Professor of Humanities at Queen Mary University in London. Best known, of course, for his work on early modern European political thought, particularly his work on Machiavelli and Hobbes, and on the formation of the concepts in political life that are so familiar to us today, like the state, freedom, citizenship, sovereignty, and so forth. He is, of course, widely known as a principal member of the Cambridge School of Intellectual History, along with the likes of John Pocock, John Donne, and Richard Tuck. His career began very auspiciously at King's College in Cambridge, where he achieved something known as a double-starred first, which, if I could translate, is basically as near to perfection as you can actually get in the British academic universe. And he was immediately translated to a fellowship of one of the colleges at Cambridge and has taught there more or less ever since, with no need for a PhD. He taught there up until 2008. He had a sojourn in the 1970s at Princeton's Institute of Advanced Study, where he did work primarily on the monumental 2-volume Foundations of Modern Political Thought, with which I'm sure many of you are familiar. When he returned to Cambridge, he was a professor of political science from 1979 to 96, and then, unusually, translated to the Regius Professor of Modern History in 1996 up until 2008, and for good measure was Pro-Vice Chancellor of the University in 1999. Among his just legion honours, awards and fellowships, I can just single out a representative sample. He holds honorary doctorates from Chicago, Harvard, Oxford, Helsinki and Leuven. Among his many, many awards and prizes, the Medal of the Collège de France, a 4-year Leverhulme Fellowship, and the Isaiah Berlin Prize. Lecture series he has given aplenty, including some of the most famous of all, like the Gauss Lectures at Princeton, the Carlyle, the Ford and the Clarendon Lectures at Oxford, and the Tanner Lectures at Harvard. Of course, his major monograph publications are the Foundations of Modern Political Thought, 1978 in 2 volumes, Reason and Rhetoric in the Philosophy of Hobbes, 1996, Liberty Before Liberalism, 1998, Hobbes and Republican Liberty, 2008, and most recently, Forensic Shakespeare, 2014. He's also produced as many as 15 co-edited works. Today he'll be talking to us about a topic we probably should have started talking about 2 years ago when we first began this program, which is the person of the state. I give you Quentin Skinner.
Thank you very much, Greg. Very generous words, and thank you very much for inviting me here. Reading the earlier papers, I see that this has been a remarkable workshop, and I'm very honoured to be delivering the farewell address. What I want to focus on today is mentioned in the title of the talk, obviously, but is more specifically about the history of the concept of the state in Anglophone political discourse. So what I want to offer you is a genealogy. Actually, it really is a Nietzschean genealogy. We can perhaps bring that out in discussion. It will be a genealogy of the different ways in which this key term has been understood and used in modern Anglophone debate. I say Anglophone, it will be largely the English and American traditions that I shall talk about. This is partly arbitrary, just to keep the materials under some kind of control. But there is also a philosophical reason for it, which is that one wouldn't want to beg the question and presuppose that if we were talking about l'État or le Staat or der Staat, we would necessarily be talking about the same thing. That would have to be shown and not presupposed, which is why I shall focus on the vocabulary of state, statehood, power of states, quite exclusively. All right, let's start by asking, how generally do we think about the concept of the state? If you look up any English language textbook in political science, you will always find an entry on the state. And there you will usually find the term explicated in usually explicitly Weberian terms as a way of referring to an apparatus of government, basically a bureaucratic apparatus, the purpose of which is essentially to maintain effective coercive control over some relatively determinate territory. I think actually I would go further and say that to any reader of the newspapers nowadays in this country or in my country, the fact is that the term state and the term government have become synonyms. By the way, if you were to look back at some of the lectures that have previously been given in the workshop, you would find that rather borne out. Steve Pincus, in his opening address this year, talked about what he called the key elements of the Weberian idea of statehood, and said states are bureaucracies with a monopoly of legitimate force. And both Bob Jessup and Julie Strauss likewise spoke of the state, as Jessup said, a locus of political forces, or Strauss, bureaucratic institutions of control. So there's one very common assumption, I think, in contemporary political science, that roughly state and government are synonyms. A second very general claim, which is commonly made, slightly less frequently than it would have been a few years ago, is that in our newly globalized world, the state is in decline. States are said to be in decline both in status and in power. They're in decline in status because as a means of shaping society, which has been their traditional role, they've come to be seen, by contrast with markets, as bad. States are monopolistic enemies of competition and enterprise. Markets are, by contrast, seen as good, enabling friend of innovation and initiative. Well, this sort of World Bank rhetoric is what Mark Revere addressed in his excellent talk earlier in the year. States are also said to be declining in power because, and this is obviously the case, of the continual rise, a great feature of 20th century legal philosophy and legal practice, the rise of international jurisdictions which had power to supervene upon the so-called sovereign powers of individual states. This has, as a matter of fact, gone further in Europe than it has in the United States, because with us in continental Europe, if you're a signatory of the Union, which my country still is for the moment, then the European Convention on Human Rights, hated by all good conservatives in my country, requires that its jurisdictions supervene upon anything purportedly sovereign in the member states of the Union. Well, if you put together the fact that states have undoubtedly lost traditional sovereign power, and of course in some cases sovereignty has ceased to be connected with states at all, and if you add to that the neoliberal rhetoric about markets, then it looks as if, as Frank Ankerschmidt wrote in 2013, the state is now shrinking, retreating into the shadows, and the concept is correspondingly losing theoretical significance. Ankerschmidt ended his polemical article. Now, for the first time in more than half a millennium, we may say that the state is on the way out. Well, there you have two very general current claims, and I want to address them. Although I shan't say much about the contention that when we speak of states, we are really just referring to apparatuses of government. Because I don't want to waste too much time in this company on this talk, which was very fashionable until a few years ago, about the death of the state. Of course, it remains a mantra of neocons, because they want to make it true, don't they? That's to say that the state is indeed on the way out, because markets will do everything that states do. I just want to say about that view of the world that it seems to me weirdly out of line with our common experience as citizens. Does anyone really suppose that states and markets are rival ways of doing the same thing? I mean, states do, and states must do, lots of things that markets don't even aspire to do. States print money, impose taxes, enforce contracts, engage in wars, penalize citizens, and legislate with an unparalleled degree of complexity. There's no other institutions in the world except states that do all of those things. Certainly not markets, which have of late, of course, been sources of wild instability and are increasingly showing a level of high dependence upon the state. Meanwhile, states, the world's leading states that is, continue without question to be the principal actors on the international stage. How could you say any doubt that? And they are by far the most significant forces within their own territories. They've become much more aggressive of late, they patrol their boundaries, they still conduct continual surveillance, as it turns out, upon their own citizens without their consent. And they've also become much more interventionist. And indeed, in the face of their collapsing banking systems, they even stepped forward as lenders of last resort. It was individual states at the crucial moment at the end of 2008 which stepped forward to lend the savings of our grandchildren to save the market. So to speak in these circumstances, if you don't mind my saying so, in the heart of free market capitalism, of the state as fading into the shadows, is, I think, inattentive. I mean, that is just not the world that we're living in. States are obviously here and very powerful, and they're going to be continually powerful for a very long time, so we must keep thinking about the state. It's very important. We all live in states. It would be terrible to be stateless. Imagine this condition being stateless. It's one of the worst things that can currently happen to you. But I don't think I need to say more about that in this company, and I want now to turn, for the rest of this lecture, to the second central claim that I've isolated about the concept of the state, namely that it's best understood, the best way of thinking about the state is to think of it as a means of referring to an institutions of government, apparatuses of control. Well, as I said, I want to offer a genealogy. And the first thing I want to say, now speaking genealogically, is that that view of the state, the most prevalent current view, is startlingly out of line with how the concept of the state was understood when it first emerged as the master noun of Anglophone political discourse. Now, that emergence can be dated rather precisely